So, what would you like to talk about tonight?
What the stress fractures were that broke the Soviet Union. Professor Sergei Plokhy, who is a Ukrainian native who teaches history at Harvard, published a book about Chernobyl, and it's like a novel. It takes you through the sequence of the events that led to the meltdown. But beyond that, he builds a case that it was Chernobyl that actually caused Gorbachev to embrace glasnost because he had no choice. And the reason is that the radiation was carried by the wind to the Nordic countries, where scientists were deeply alarmed by the levels of radiation in the lower atmosphere. And this kept, they kept pounding the Kremlin, which of course controlled Ukraine at that time. It was part of the orbit of the USSR. And the Kremlin said, "Oh, nothing wrong. We shut down our reactors, but no, nothing to worry about." But as the impact of the disaster grew and the footprint of the radiation spread, really Moscow had no choice. And I think it's an interesting and provocative argument. I put it in the category of the 1419 project, that it's a different way to frame history that doesn't necessarily displace other analyses or arguments. And so, yes, bogging down the Soviet Union in Afghanistan was Zbig Brzezinski's big idea. It's also linked, and I would invite Adnan. In fact, it looks like he's still on the Zoom, but if you want to jump back in, Adnan, what's interesting to me is that people have analyzed Brzezinski's ideas and come away believing that it was bigger than just the quagmire in Afghanistan. It was starting a global conflict between Shia and Sunni. So Adnan, I'd be interested in your comments on that, because that does seem to be one of the arcs that originates with the US covert operations that kept the Soviets locked down in Afghanistan for so long.
Well, that's a very interesting suggestion. I like the idea that Chernobyl may have had an important effect. That hasn't often.
I do remember. Sorry to interrupt. I do remember there was, I think, avian flu in China that had not spread worldwide, but they referred to it possibly as who's Chernobyl. They thought that would bring down the who's government. That's not so. Go ahead. So you're saying, Professor Hussein, Peter B. Collins is saying that Zbigniew Brzezinski plotted a war between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Wasn't the animus already there between Shia and Sunni?
Well, I mean, of course, that's like saying Catholics and Protestants. Wasn't the animus there? Of course,
Right.
there is historical basis, doctrinal differences, and historical conflict that you have to take into account. But that doesn't mean that you put Protestants and Catholics just by their own will definitely compete and start wars with one another. I mean, that's part of a particular period of history, the wars of religion in Europe, for example. Similarly, Sunni and Shia, there have been periods of rapprochement, of cooling of hostilities, or even of coming together with doctrinal ideas that overlapped. And there are many mixed societies that have not been riven by conflict. I think what's happened in the modern period, and also the period of greatest I don't know, I guess you could say animosity was actually in the early modern period after the initial schism, because the Ottomans made Sunni Islam the official state doctrine and religion, and opposed Iran, which under Shah Ismail and the Safavids adopted Shiism as the official state religion for Iran. And because these were two regional powers competing for Iraq, essentially, they ended up coming into conflict and exacerbating the terms of the conflict in Shi'i-Sunni schismatic terms. And so, but after the 15th, 16th century, this has not been such a live conflict. It's in the modern period, during the period of the Iranian Revolution, which initially really presented itself, even though it happened in Iran, and because of Shi'i scholars like Khomeini and others leading a popular revolution to establish the new Islamic Republic of Iran, it had a broader basis. I mean, it did not emphasize Sunni Shi'i differences. It tried to create forms of Islamic doctrine that could appeal to both and present them in an anti-imperialist politics, was against the U.S. control of Iran, and likewise the U.S. involvement and domination of the Middle East, also, of course, through proxy or allied powers like Israel. And so it had a larger vision of the Middle East as free from foreign intervention, that it thought it could make common cause with Sunnis on. And it was, in fact, actually inspiring politically and religiously in many ways among, Sunni Muslims all across the Islamic world initially. However, the United States, supporting the conservative Gulf monarchies, and especially Saudi Arabia, essentially tried to emphasize the traditional Salafist Wahhabi hostility towards Shi'is, which we see even to this day when the Saudis executed those 81, the Saudi government executed 81 people just a couple of weeks ago. The vast majority of them were Shi'is from the Saudi Shi'i minority in Saudi. So they, exacerbated this kind of conflict and portrayed Iran as a threat to Sunni control of the rest of the Arab Middle East, and talked about a Shi'i crescent because of Hezbollah and Syria being pro-Iran during this period and being ruled by a religious minority that, while not like obviously a Shi'i movement, is one of the kind of medieval splinters of kind of, the Shi'i stream. And so they characterized all of this as a Shi'i crescent that was designed, to dominate the Sunnis. And so they characterized and portrayed this as one of sectarian rivalry, when there were a lot of other geopolitical, kinds of reasons for their conflict that were, of course, exacerbated by US support and alliance to try and hem in Iran. So yes, there is the Shi'i-Sunni split, but you have to see that as something being manufactured, not because it didn't exist in terms of doctrinal differences and ritual differences, but it became politically meaningful because of changing geopolitical circumstances. You have long periods of, Sunnis and Shi'is getting along fine, and those differences not mattering all that much.
It's interesting because when Zbigniew Brzezinski was in the Carter administration, the hostages were taken by Iran. They were Shiites. We felt crippled by that. And so the idea is that Zbigniew Brzezinski ginned up more competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Saudi Arabia being Sunni, to
well, if you recall, when Juan Cole was a guest on the show maybe a year ago at this point, not his most recent appearance, but his February last year, February 2021, I think he came on, and he talked a little bit about how the Iranian Revolution was seen for many as a kind of popular social
Right.
protest. It had a lot of class implications, and what they
Right.
were decrying about the Saudis was not, oh, they're Sunnis and they believe the wrong thing. What they decried was that the Saudis were, oppressing the people, keeping all of the wealth to themselves, and doing nothing about the rampant inequality and lack of development in the wider, region. And so it was a kind of class analysis in some ways, and that had to be derailed because, that had a real chance to create a popular sort of front. This is exactly what we talk about in the 50s and 60s of the Arab Cold Wars, that there were radical, popular, often unfortunately military, but socialist regimes that came to power on a platform of meeting the needs of the people and breaking the feudal powers of the earlier oligarchic or post-Ottoman kind of rulership, the kings that were in place, or the ones who the British put in during the Mandate, period, versus the Gulf monarchies that were allied with the West and who were in place because of first British kind of support and power, and then subsequently the US support and power. And so really the story of the Middle East is of these populist attempts to establish social justice in various forms that have often been derailed during the Cold War period by exacerbating religious conflict to divide people. In much the same way in the United States, we get racial conflict as a way of dividing the working class.
Peter?
Well, what I was going to say is that the US either was stunningly brilliant and cynical or just totally ignorant as we decapitated the government of the Sunni minority in Iraq and tried to install a US-style democracy run by Shiites who are, much more loyal to Iran. And this seemed to be another expression of efforts to militarize or weaponize that divide between, do you say Shi'i instead of Shia? In the US media, they typically say Shia.
Yeah, Shia is for the collective group. Shi'i is the modifier. So
Okay,
like an
you.
adjective. Yeah,
Mhm.
Shi'i, Muslim.
Mm-hmm. So what's your comment on that, Adnan, related to Iraq and the US divide and blunder strategy?
Well, that exactly exacerbated, it was exactly the same dynamic that I was mentioning between Iran and the rest of the Middle East, is that by, decapitating the state, toppling it, destroying the institutions, demobilizing, the largest employer, in the country, which was the army, sending all these people home with no paycheck and, no social support to their own devices, that immediately forms of organization outside of the state became, political. The way you could survive was banding together with others who you shared some kind of group identity with. And in the new democratic politics of the, elections and the state created by the Coalition Provisional Authority, first under Bremer, and then, in subsequent
remember
versions.
him? Yeah.
Oh yes, Paul Bremer.
God.
That what it did was it encouraged the politicization of your religious identity for the sake of parliamentary politics and establishing a bloc and ensuring that your community would have representation and not be left out of the spoils of the new state and the aid that was flowing from the United States. Mm-hmm. And so it exacerbated these divisions that, yes, they existed as different groupings, but if you talk to any Iraqis who were educated in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, is they did not refer to themselves principally. There were an awful lot of intermarriages, which is, I think, one of the major social signs of these kinds of forms of identity not having the same social purpose and utility that they would in other conditions. So, we had a different circumstance where people didn't identify principally or first through their religious or confessional community or identity. they were Arabs. There was this ideology of Arab nationalism. And of course, that left out the Kurds. And there were other, ethnic minority groups and linguistic minority groups that would be suppressed under such a system. But this was a system that, de-emphasized these religious divisions. These religious divisions that, of course, exist socially became important and significant politically in the post-US invasion political environment and the system that they created. And so when we talk about, it was a way for the US to sort of deny responsibility. It's like, well, we tried to give these people democracy and, get rid of the boogeyman, who'd been oppressing them. But, in the end, alas, despite our best intentions and doing so much, spending our blood and treasure to free them, they weren't capable of democracy because they just fell prey to their atavistic, internecine conflict, when in fact, actually, the US created the conditions for those to be meaningful in ways that for a generation, they hadn't really been that significant to people.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thanks, Adnan.
Thank you, Professor
Thank you.
Adnan.